I've been working for the past few weeks on a few different things. Mostly though, I've started the Overworld system, refactored a big part of the user interface, and also made the player dying way more interesting. This is a game about exploration and discovery in a procedurally generated, high fantasy world, and I'm planning to get something playable for everyone by the end of the year. Well, that's the plan at least. Let's see if we can do it. Anyway, so I'll talk a bit about what I got done this month, and then at the end of this video, we'll have a nice little catch up. So get ready to be caught up with. The main thing I was working on this week was the new Overworld system. This is a procedurally generated game at the end of the day, but I kind of want the player to have some way to affect the procedural algorithm, and the way I've decided to do this is by using an overworld, where they can select a different place to explore from. Originally, the plan was to do this overworld in 2D, but eventually I decided it would probably just be easier to do it all in 3D, as everything else is in 3D. So the plan was that when the player would return to the main menu screen, they'd be presented with this 3D render of the overworld, and they'd be able to choose where they want to go. Now, what that meant was I had to be able to render terrain, render things like oceans, and then also render a scene on top of that. So actually, what ended up making way more sense was just to use the gameplay world system that I'd already created to actually render that stuff. So I've now got a new world object, which actually just inherits from the procedural exploration world, which is what the gameplay itself is based on, which is used to render the overworld. So what this means is that I get all of terrain and entities and all the animations and stuff like that out of the box. The code is already there, so it's going to be way more flexible. And then the idea was that I'd render that all to a texture and you'd be able to see it on the main menu. But also, it took a long time. So once I had that scene created, it wasn't too hard to just render it to a texture and plaster it onto the main menu. The big problem I had was that obviously I had aspirations to render like quite interesting animations when you transition between the two screens. And I couldn't really do that without doing some weird things. So the idea is you tap on the overworld and it transitions to the overworld screen by kind of like zooming into the overworld, and it just looks kind of cool. So from the main menu screen it zoomed out, and then when you actually go to select, it'll zoom itself in. Now the issue was that this is one single render and it has to be able to transition between these two states. So things like trying to resize the render texture as part of the compositor system, that didn't really work because unfortunately if you're doing it as part of an animation, you're doing it each frame. So I had like real stuttering issues with that. And also getting the aspect ratio to be correct is actually quite difficult. But the way I ended up doing it was actually at all times you render the texture to be exactly the size of the screen. And then when you come to render it on the main menu, you essentially just like punch a hole into that smaller rendering. Then when you actually come to zoom into it, it's quite easy to resize the texture because you're not resizing the texture. You're only resizing the actual like rendering of the texture. And then I just had to do a bit of other extra stuff to figure out how to get the aspect ratio correct. And before you know it, you had a nice little zoom in effect. And speaking of some of the other stupid technical things that are now in place, I've also updated my level editor to be able to edit overworlds. And as you can see from this notepad, I've kind of had an attempt at drawing an overworld. One of the things I want to stress though is that this is all going to be the open source base. So I'm going to put a lot more work into the closed source like lore building. So really a lot of this stuff is going to be like very generic RPG game and kind of just there to test the tech. And also with the editor tool, I can edit things like the scene tree. However, I am still having some problems with the terrain as it is based on the procedural world, which does like the odd few modifications to kind of give that world that flat appearance, which looks kind of cool during gameplay. But what that essentially means is that editor-wise, what you see is not what you get. It wasn't designed for any of this stuff, that's why there's problems. But to be honest, at this point, I'd worked on the overworld for about a week, and I was kind of sick of it by then. So I decided to move on and do something else. We've now got initial support for player damage effects. So now when the player gets damaged in any way, the screen kind of animates red for a few frames. I've also got all the infrastructure ready for more complex effects, so I can do things like combine different effects once they're all in the game. But to be honest, this is something that I've really kind of wanted for a while, and it makes it nice. So something like if you're moving through the desert and you walk into a cactus, the screen will make it obvious that you've taken damage, when before, like, you couldn't really tell. I've reorganized some parts of the main gameplay screen, so essentially it's close to being as done as I think I need it to for this MVP. So I've got things like, finally, I've replaced the player direction button with an actual proper joystick, so you can kind of see what you're doing. It just looks a lot cleaner doing that. I've moved the wheeled button so it's now up in the top, and it also has an icon rather than just being a button that says wheeled. And just a few other things were spruced up. So now if you get one of those exploration discovered pop-ups, what it does is it will like fade the background icons where the pop-up's been placed. So you can kind of see the pop-up more than anything, but you can still see that the icons are at the back. And that means that you can still tap them and they still work and things like that. It's just a lot more usable, and it's good that all this stuff is kind of shoved up out of the way, because to be honest, you don't see the pop-up very often. And I've also got some new icons in the main menu screen, all of which were made by ChatGPT again. I've refactored the inventory system so it can just be placed into the main menu. It's now implemented as a specific object, so I can just reuse it across the actual inventory screen and the main menu. And I also took the opportunity to reorganize some of the inventory screen while I was there. So things like you can now see the player indicator on mobile, like previously it wasn't there. And I've tried to kind of smush some of the icons into that a bit better, just so you can kind of see where things are. But I've got to admit, the inventory screen is probably one of the things that needs like the most work. And also on some smaller screens, it doesn't look good. Like, I don't know if you can see that, but it clips over the side. Not what I want. I've added an outline to the compass rendering for readability. So before, the texture which just is drawn to the screen only rendered white, which actually made it quite difficult to read in some cases. So what I'm doing is I'm using a shader to determine the outline for the compass edges, which makes it stand out way more. The thing is that doing an outline with a shader is kind of expensive, and it just involves quite a few samples that wouldn't have been necessary before. So the outline is there, it does look good, and yeah, to be honest, it's probably just worth the cost. I've refracted the player actions dialogue, so it's now a much more subtle dialogue thing that pops up when the player can do something in the environment. This is kind of interesting though, as this is the first use of Lottie animations in the game. So I did end up spending a little while trying to get the animation as I wanted it. So it's really just like a small finger that animates touching a screen, but it's all kind of like matte white and stuff, and it just looks cool. I love it. So the benefit of this is that it's stored as a JSON file and then rasterized on the user's actual device. So the animation is super flexible, and it also means that it's always going to be pixel perfect for however big you need it. I fixed a long-standing issue that might cause the game to just completely lock up after a second expiration. I put that one off for a long time because for some reason in my head I thought it was a horrible bug. It turned out to be a one-line fix. And finally, when talking about polish, I've decided to completely scrap the old player death screen and replace it with this new fancy animation thing. So the idea is that when the player dies, the screen kind of goes black and you see the player and they do like that, faint and die type thing that you get in traditional like Zelda or that sort of thing. And then all the player's items would kind of like come spewing out of them, and you'd see all the things you'd lost by dying, and then it would all like sort of fade to black, and yeah, it's gonna look cool. So starting work on that, I actually had a really fantastic idea, which was that the best way to do this would be to like piggyback on top of the system that I have to push worlds onto the world stack. So whenever you go into a house, what it does is it pauses the old world and pushes new world onto this world stack. So what I decided is the best way to do this animation would be to create a world specifically for the player to die in. And it does things like create all the models and all the environments and that sort of thing. And then you get all the benefits of it's also a world. So if you want to spawn items or coins or anything like that, and then that means I don't have to have like any flags in the actual gameplay world to say like, is player dead? In that case, do this animation. It can all live, all of this logic inside this new player world. So I'm quite pleased with that actually. So yeah, the player dies, and I also have this new screen which doesn't really have much information on it other than the animate the text that says you died, and the button to appear at the bottom. I'm kind of really seeing the benefit of the technical base I've built here actually, because it's able to support quite a few different things. I mean, some of the, if I do say so myself, some of the architecture was quite good, and it just means I can move quickly now if the code base isn't just a complete rat's nest. There are still some disgusting parts of it, but you know, we'll get there. So that's essentially everything I got done for this month. And you might have heard the word month there and thought, what? Why is it monthly? And it's nothing too big. Essentially, I had a bit of a cold like a couple of weeks ago, and I just kind of didn't really feel like making a video. Sorry about that. But also, I just kind of like, I kind of kept working. Like, I just kind of really got into the zone, and I kind of just like wanted to carry on with it. You know, having a deadline now, it's really kind of nice to have a deadline because I actually feel like I've got something to work towards. But it's just like I could really get my head kind of into it, and I could just see all the kind of progress coming along. These videos, like honestly, it's good to have a nice touch point with the audience, but they do take a long time to make, and this is kind of one of the things that I've had to kind of grapple with. Realistically, it takes about like a quarter of all development time to make a weekly video, so it's a lot of time, and that's quite a few features that could be made that aren't being made because I'm making the video instead. So there is somewhere between, you know, like it's obviously very useful to have an audience there, and this is like the main marketing strategy for this game, right? So I'm not denying that that's important, but I kind of just fancied a break, you know? Like this year, basically every week, I've made a video, so it's gone on for a long time. I kind of feel like you guys prefer progress on the game more than necessarily the videos. Obviously the videos are cool, but if it's a one-man thing doing everything, then, you know, it's a tricky one. So next week, I'm actually going on holiday, and I'm actually leaving the country to go on holiday, which I basically haven't done since COVID, because I've just been working, I guess. I've kind of decided actually I'm going to do nothing that week, literally. I'm not going to think about work or anything like that. I'm going to have a bit of time to decompress, and I'm going to play that new Hollow Knight game that I've been waiting for many years. So yeah, no video next week realistically, and it might stretch on into the next month. But yeah, I mean, development is going well. I'm kind of in a mindset at the moment, like the past month or so, I've just been really like happy with how things are going, and I'm kind of optimistic. Sometimes I look at the game and I'm just like, wow, actually, I can really see where it's going. And that's exciting, because when I was starting it was such a slog, you know, like figuring out what it was and where it was going and all that stuff. That's the like unglamorous bit of game development that no one ever tells you have to do. So I'm going to have fun playing that new Hollow Knight game, and I'll give you my review of it in the next video I make. How about that? So stick around for that. Get subscribed. It's going to be fun.